So today, in our reading in the book of Job, we're back in the meeting of the Heavenly Council. They seem to have quite a few meetings. It's a bit like a church PCC, I think. They have to meet, at least once every 6 weeks. I'm not sure who the secretary was in that Heavenly Council, and there is a deep theological question: what biscuits did they have? But we're not going to get into that in this sermon. One of the items on the agenda of this Heavenly Council meeting in God's presence in heaven, one of the agenda items seems to be a standing item. It's something that's cropped up more than once, and here it is again, and that item is Job. God reminds the council in this item number 9, Job's life has gone very, very wrong, but he's still righteous, isn't he? God says to all those gathered. He's still upright. He's still doing the right thing. And it's then that Satan wonders with God, well, has Job really suffered enough for this to be a fair test? Yeah, of course he's still worshipping you, God, because his life's still relatively easy. Stuff's gone wrong, but it's not that bad, is it? And so Satan says, skin for skin, somewhat ominously. Now, a reminder for those of you who have forgotten it or who've missed it, when we're reading in our reading here, the word Satan, I don't want you to think of Satan with a capital S, because that's not what it is. It's actually a Hebrew word that's used in this part of the Bible, Hasatan. And it is from that word that we get our word Satan. Hasatan. You could pronounce Satan. Hasatan. And it doesn't mean Satan, it simply means the accuser. And in our first sermon in this book of Job, I said that the accuser is something like Her Majesty's loyal opposition in our own parliaments. So the accuser is in opposition, but is loyal, at least at this point, to God's. I know that's a little bit confusing and hard to get your head around, but there it is. Now that's a bit of a detail. It's an interesting detail, but it might not be the most important thing. In the last couple of weeks, we've been asking some really tough questions. Questions that you may have asked at some point in your own life. And those questions are, why does suffering happen? Why is this bad stuff happening to me? I reckon that question gets asked a lot in our community, mainly when it's tipping it down in June and you happen to be a farmer. Why is this happening to me? We've got a crop to get in. This is not the plan. And the answer, at least in the book of Job, is suffering happens because God and a heavenly being called Hasatan have a bet. Now that sounds like a ridiculous, ludicrous answer to a really difficult question. It sounds like the book of Job is not taking that seriously at all. But the thing is, it's a very difficult question and there is no easy answer. The next question that we asked is, how should we respond when faced with suffering? And it's another slightly improbable answer. Maybe the best way we can respond is by worshipping God. And the question before us today that I'd like to ask in this sermon is, how much suffering is too much suffering? How much suffering is too much suffering? In my experience of life, limited as it is, being such a very young man, in all my talking, that was a joke, by the way, you can join in and laugh, it's okay. In all my talking to people, and having a clerical collar helps when we talk to people, I've learned that everybody has a story. I'm convinced everybody has a story. A story of life being difficult or challenging. I'll give you a few examples. One that surprised me was the first time I actually sat down and bothered to listen to my grandma. And she told me that when she was born, she was so small and weak that she was swaddled, and then the midwife took her and placed her at the end of the garden and waited for her to die. It was her grandma who went out and fetched her back in and kept her alive on cinder water and the warmth of the fire. She then told me that when she married, she was tiny. She only had a 22-inch waist, which I was flabbergasted at, because my grandma later on then had thyroid problems, and I'd only ever known her as a very large, elderly lady. She told me then that her husband, my granddad, who I never met, returned from the Second World War with deep and lasting psychological problems. He did return, but was that better than not return? It was a close run thing. And so I learned the story of my grandma's suffering. I've got my own story. My wife has multiple sclerosis. I still remember the day she was diagnosed and how shocked we both were. But as time progressed, I began to think, well, maybe this is not that big a deal. Maybe it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. Maybe it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. But I'm not the one who has to live daily with chronic fatigue and debilitating muscle spasms. So I would say, oh, it's not as bad as I thought. And now Zoe, through the treatment that she's had for her multiple sclerosis, her thyroid's been destroyed, and that she has to battle with that and take drugs for that. Another example is I remember my first funeral visit, the first funeral I ever did. I visited a lady who was in her 30s. Her daughter was less than 6 months old. I remember her daughter being in a carry cot there for this funeral meeting. Her partner was a very successful rock guitarist. For those of you who like popular music, he played guitar for Jarvis Cocker. And he had fallen down the stairs in their home and died before he hit the bottom of the stairs. And I remember her suffering. Not long after that, I conducted a funeral for the father of a teenager in the youth ministry I ran at the time. And the father had killed himself in his car with exhaust fumes. And then a year or so later, I helped in the funeral of that teenage boy's younger sister, who suffered a fit in the bath and drowned. But I wondered, how much suffering is too much suffering? On a work trip to Cape Town that I took a few years ago, I visited a school where the children experienced the best day of their school careers when each of them was given a new pencil. What kind of world do we live in where on one side of the world the latest technology is basically obsolete after 12 months, and on the other side of the world a pencil changes your life? The irony is, of course, that the mineral needed to make our technology is mined from that same continent on which pencils are changing lives. And I'm sure that those miners who do mine for that mineral aren't paid fair wages and struggle with terrible working conditions. And that country is so poor, despite being mineral rich, that they're facing challenging times from terrorist organisations who seek to control those mines to make a lot of money so they can wage a terrorist war on the nations who are so desperate to have the most up-to-date gadgets. It would be laughable if it weren't so sad. How much suffering is too much? Skin for skin, says the accuser, because whatever else the Bible is, what it is not is a clear, simple and basic book that gives you instructions on how to live your life. It's much richer and more complex than that. It wrestles with the mystery of life and seeks to illuminate the divine. It would be remiss of me to not point out that the manner in which God acts towards Job in these opening chapters are nowhere else repeated in the book of the Bible. They're not typical or normative. God is not in heaven taking a wager on you and how much suffering you can face. This is not a normal story. But what is typical and what is normal perhaps are the questions that Job asks himself, and maybe you've asked at times of frustration. How much more of this can I take? How much more of this can I endure? Job's friends come and sit Shiva with him. It's a Jewish word. It's something that Jewish people still do today because it's an eminently sensible thing to do. For 7 days they're with Job, they're sharing his suffering, but they're not allowed to say anything unless Job speaks to them first. They want to share in his suffering, they want to be there for Job, but they don't want trite or inane comments to weary Job in his suffering. And so they sit in silence with him. At this point in his life, Job is sat in a pile of ashes, wearing the clothes that he ripped, covered in sores, and with his head shaved. He's unrecognisable to his close friends. And it does seem that they were expecting the worst. In verse 11 of our reading, they agreed to meet together beforehand, before they go to see Job. It's almost said, hey lads, let's get all our ducks in a row on this one. Job's going to be in a terrible state. What are we going to say to him? How are we going to make this all right? Spoiler alert, when they do get round to speaking to Job, they don't come up with anything particularly wise or clever. And Mrs. Job is not much more helpful. Her counsel is that her husband should curse God and so be guilty of blasphemy and then die. Get it out of the way, she says. She's lost all her children, all the family possessions, all the security, all her hope for the future, and her husband is suffering a dreadful skin disease. How much suffering is too much? All of us have different answers to that question. In the Western world, we're averse to suffering. We're not used to it. We have less tolerance for it than elsewhere in the world. Some of us say, what will be, will be. Life has dealt you a tough hand, but play the cards, you've just got to get on with it. Others struggle mentally, often not helped by the quirks of modern life. We barely have enough time to nurture the kind of meaningful friendships where we can talk to our friends and they can help us. We don't have enough time to appreciate the beauty of the world we live in, something that would help us. We're surrounded by media and social media that tells us time and again, your life is not as good as anybody else's. We're bombarded with media and advertising that tells us silly things like, you just need a good drink, that'll help you. And yet, within each and every one of us, there is the breath of God. The second most depressing book in the Bible, after Job, is the book of Ecclesiastes. And the author of Ecclesiastes reminds us that God has made everything beautiful in its time. And God has placed eternity in the hearts of humanity. But we cannot fathom the mystery of life. How much suffering is too much? I guess that depends on how much hope we have. Christ has come to give us more hope than we can fathom, more hope than we can imagine. But so many of us find hope elusive. Even for those, Christ throws open the door of heaven and invites us to eternity where God will wipe away every tear. There will be no more suffering or sorrow. And Christ has come. Come and meet Job's friends with the funny names that Dan did very well to pronounce. Hear the ways in which they were right and the ways in which they were wrong. But rest in the hope that I have won for you. So may Christ give us hope. May the Spirit strengthen us to share that hope with others. And Father God, may your kingdom come in the places of the world where there is suffering and sorrow. Amen.